already this morning who have had some very difficult situations in their own lives. And I'm aware that people have strong emotions about this. Everyone does. And I hope that this morning you'll be able to listen and to hear what I have to say from my own experience, and also just from what the evidence shows as well, and that I will be able to present it in such a way that it won't be unpalatable. I understand that people who feel strongly that this should be something that's available for people most of them have a very good heart and have very good motivation. And so when we're talking about these issues, we're not trying to malign anyone's motivation for doing these things. Just because something is being done with good motivation doesn't necessarily mean it's the best idea. I know that this morning our presentations, Larry and I are both very much opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide, and there was some effort to try to have other voices represented, but that didn't work out. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold as well. That didn't work out, and so we decided, well, we would come anyway, and we would give our side, and we would try to address the issues that other people are having as well. The other thing I wanted to say before I started is all you have to do is Google my name, and you realize that I'm a Christian, and we're meeting in a church, and all of those things. And my Christian faith is very important to me, and it does inform who I am as a person. And I think it would be a pretty sad thing if something that you held deeply didn't inform who you were and wasn't integrated into who you are as a person. However, because it's very important to me, I also have very deep respect for other people who have other philosophies or belong to other faiths. And so my hope this morning is that I will be able to present from my perspective, but I think that each of you is intelligent enough to be able to translate the things that I'm saying into your own philosophical framework and into your own faith or just philosophical basis. Everybody believes something, even if you haven't articulated it very well to yourself. And what you believe informs what you do and how you think. So I'm going to come from my standpoint because I feel that that's the most respectful thing I can do for you, is to just share with you who I am and to respect you for who you are and where you are. So we always have, as doctors, we always have to give a disclosure statement about not having any commercial interests. Most people say, I wish I did have, but we don't. I also have my own personal disclosure statement, which is my Anne of Green Gables disclosure statement, where Anne says to Marilla, although I say far too much, yet if you only knew how many things I want to say and don't, you'd give me some credit for it. So that's my disclosure statement this morning that is probably more important than the other one, because I have been dealing with patients and their families for the last 25 years, and so much of this is really where I live. I also lost my own mother after a 14-year battle with cancer when she was younger than I am now. So, and we had also 2 cousins who died in their teens. So I've been associated with, I've had it from a personal standpoint, and I've also had it from a professional standpoint. I also just lost my dad from Alzheimer's at 92, so my mom was 61 and my dad was 92. So I've been at both ends of that. Also, I know that there's going to be a lot of text up on the screen, and I do that on purpose. Where I come from in Vancouver, we have a lot of folks where English isn't their first language, and so sometimes it's easier to read it. The other thing that you will have at the end of the slides is my email address and Larry's email address, and I always make my slides available to anyone who would want them. So if you want the references, if you want to be able to look it up on your own, you can just send me an email and I will send you a PDF copy of the slides so it doesn't take up your entire inbox, and you can look up the references that are on that. The other thing I'm encouraging you to do is to think about it today as a smorgasbord. And you don't have to eat everything. In fact, you'll probably be very sick if you try to. But to choose those things that are most compelling to you and kind of chew on those for a while. Think about what strikes you and go from there. And then think about your own stories and your own experiences and what rings true with what we have to say versus that. Most people have the same feeling that Woody Allen did. He says, I don't mind dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens. And I think that actually is really part of, it's quite a succinct summary of why this is being pushed, because people have a lot of fear about end of life, about not so much about what happens afterward, but about the dying process itself. And if there's something that can help them kind of stay out of that, to get death before death gets them, that they're actually interested in that, and it really comes from a place of fear. So why should we discuss these issues? I have I've spoken to physicians, but as well, and why we should be thinking about it. But for all of us, this is a really complex, serious medical ethical issue. And as Larry did such a great job of outlining, it has real implications, not just for those few people that are being put forward in the media right now as possibly needing it, but for each of us and for our culture in general. And it's very interesting that deliberate killing by physicians has been sort of a taboo for Hippocratic physicians anyway, since the time of Hippocrates, which was 400 BC. So it wasn't a Christian idea. Christians actually picked up on it, but it was not started by Christians. And at the time of Hippocrates, I have this a little bit later. At the time of Hippocrates, it was the people feared the healers, because the people who were the healers had the drugs, and there was no code of ethics. And if someone that hated you down the street paid the healer, the shaman or the physician or whatever, more than you paid him or her, mostly it was a him in those days, more than you paid him, then he would kill you. So Hippocrates started with a small group of people, and he made his students affirm the oath before they started to say that they would not give deadly medicine to anyone, even if they were asked. And the patients started voting with their feet. They wanted to go to someone who they knew had taken an oath not to kill, and even if they had been paid a lot of money by the enemy down the street. So, and some people are saying, well, the Hippocratic Oath, it's pretty wishy-washy in places when you see the modern retellings and everything. If you go back to the original Greek, it's in there not to give deadly medicine to anyone, even if asked. It's in a little bit more archaic language, but that was one of the bedrocks of the Hippocratic physicians. It took a while for everybody didn't just say, oh, that's a great idea at the time. It took a while for it to happen, but we have been maintaining and supporting and protecting Hippocratic medicine for 2,400 years. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of intent. Larry touched on the idea that we are not opposed to people at the end of life, or even already in Canada, you have the right to refuse or withdraw any treatment, no matter how life-giving it is. So even if you decided that you had to be fed by a tube, you didn't want a feeding tube anymore, you have the right to, at this moment, right now, with the current legislation, to refuse that. And that's your right. So we're not talking about refusing treatment or refusing heroic treatment or refusing to go to the intensive care unit or to die with tubes and all of these things. We're talking about actual intentional killing, or providing the means for the patient to kill himself or herself. And people say, often I've heard people say, well, what does it matter what the intent is? The person's just as dead. And I would say to you, it matters a lot. Our entire legal system is based upon intent. And it's interesting that it's not based upon motivation. It's based upon intent. Even if you had a good motivation, Robert Latimer went to prison for killing his daughter because he intended to kill her, not because he wasn't motivated by, at least from his own thoughts in his own heart, that he was doing what was best for his daughter. So intent means, what did I intend to do? Did I intend for this person to be dead? So the way I like to describe this is, if I told you that this week I ran over a child with my car on the street in front of my house, can you tell me what my punishment is? No, you can't, because you don't know whether I was fully in control of my vehicle, not speeding, not talking on my cell phone, had good brakes, and the child just ran out in front of me chasing a ball, and I slammed on the brakes, but I still hit him. Now, he's still dead, but then there are the nuances of, was I distracted, was my car in repair, was I speeding, all of those things, and those have other consequences. But if I had really hated this little brat and was waiting around the corner until he came out of his house and ran him down on purpose, that's murder. So he's just as dead. I've used the same car, but my intent makes every difference in how it's seen. So this idea that it doesn't matter what your intention is very important, and that has a lot to do with why are we doing the things that we are doing? Why are we giving extra pain medication? Why are we doing these things? Is it because we want the person to be dead, or is it because we want to relieve pain? We want to relieve suffering. So I think it's important for us to participate, for physicians and everyone else to participate in civil discussions about these things. And we all make, as I said before, decisions based on philosophical principles. And you know, respectful civil discourse is really hard to find. There's a young woman you've probably seen in the news who moved from California to Oregon because she has a brain tumor so that she could make use of assisted suicide in the state of Oregon, being a resident. And I know a young woman who lives in the state of Colorado, who's 37 years old and has 4 children, and she's in her terminal phase of breast cancer, and she felt so upset about this that she wrote an open letter to this young woman saying, please, don't do this. There are people who will love you and come alongside you. And a high number of people got on the blog of the woman in Colorado and called her all sorts of names, basically kind of yelling at her, telling her to stop stuffing her religion down this woman's throat, and what did she know about it? It wasn't her life, and saying all kinds of nasty things, cursing and swearing and doing all these things on her blog. Now, that's not civil discourse. It's fine to disagree. I am very happy to have discussions with anyone who has different opinions, or there are some tough cases, there are some things that are hard, but to have that kind of a thing, I have said some very mild things on the radio different times. I've had an email from someone who told me that he hoped I died a very painful death. I've had another one that said that I guess somebody had to graduate at the bottom of the medical school class, and someone else, anyone who knows about palliative care will realize how ludicrous this is, that the only reason I didn't want people to be able to end their lives was because I made so much money being a palliative care physician. So that is kind of the atmosphere that is out there for people who are talking about this, and I don't want to see that happen. Today here, I hope we can have, maybe there'll be some spirited discussion. That would be fine with me, as long as we keep it respectful and we talk about the issues. And I hope that I am doing that. And if I don't do that, and you feel that I have said something that has been disrespectful to you, come and talk to me about it, because I don't want to be that. I don't want to be a person who feeds into that kind of what I call an abusive system. And really in a democracy, views that are deeply held should be part of the discussion. But right now, anything that has any sort of faith to it is not welcome in the public forum. So most of what I will talk about today is really from a secular perspective, but if you're interested in some of the faith-based things, there are some things for that too. And I think one of the things we need to try to do for each other is to speak each other's language so that we're not saying, well, you're a pro-death person because you believe that. I don't use that language. I understand that people have a good motivation for wanting these things, and I'm trying not to be disrespectful. So where are these things legal? Euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide are legal in some form in Oregon, Washington, and in Vermont. Vermont's had it legal for a year, but nobody's taken advantage of it. They've had no deaths under their law there. It's also legal in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and it's actually been legal for quite a while in Switzerland. In Quebec, the bill has been passed, but we're awaiting the law. And in Germany, they have a policy of non-prosecution. And there's limbo in Montana. They've been debating back and forth. There are people who will say that it's legal there, but it's not. And the courts have said doctors who participate could be up for prosecution. So they're still talking about it. The Montana legislature only meets once every 2 years. So they came very close to passing, making sure that it was illegal in their last legislature, but that didn't pass, so it's been in kind of a state of limbo. And in one of the places, I think it's in New Mexico or something, one county actually legalized it, but the county doesn't have any jurisdiction over it. It's a state or a federal issue, so that's kind of weird. So there has been massive media attention with this, especially this week. I almost didn't even want to open the internet and look at what was out there. It just felt like it was being bombarded, and polls and all of these things. And it just gets kind of depressing thinking about death all the time. Palliative care is so hopeful and so life-giving that people are really living to the last moments of their life. But this is just like, life is so terrible, I just want to end it. And it's really kind of depressing. But one of the things that I have noticed with this is that the media are not doing, in my opinion, an adequate job in looking at what some of the problems are that Larry had. I listened to some reporting on the CBC program called The 180 a year ago. It was in the spring. And I sent a 4-page letter to the producer saying, there's all this stuff that you didn't talk about. And I got an email back saying, we'll give you 3 minutes. So, well, it was better than nothing. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was what was going on in jurisdictions where this was already legal. And they wouldn't let me talk about it. They said it was not part of the Canadian experience. And I said, I need to talk about this. And they said, well, fine, we'll record it, but we always reserve the right. We reserve the right to edit for length. So anyway, you can guess what part got edited out. So, but I said to them, if this, and I have this in the slides later, if this were a pipeline or a nuclear power plant or something along those lines, you would be all over this. You would go to every place on the planet that had a nuclear power plant and see how that was working there. You would go to places, how many times have we heard about the pipeline that leaked in Kalamazoo, Michigan? That's not Canadian experience. This has just been given a free pass. And oftentimes what you'll hear in the media is things like, well, there are no reported problems in jurisdictions where this is legal. Well, as I'll show you, in Washington and Oregon, they don't actually have a reporting process, so no, there's no reported problems, but that doesn't mean there are no problems. So this is what is happening when you think about what bulldogs the media usually are in looking into things that have to do with public safety or our environment or human rights issues, these types of things. This type of rigor is simply not being applied to this issue. So I call it the don't ask so you don't have to tell. So public discussions about this issue tend to focus on autonomy, which means I get to make decisions for myself, individual rights, avoiding suffering, and disability as indignity. And I'm going to go through these. And I also hope that we will be able to do these things. I think I've talked about that. The other part to this is that I hope that we will come away from today understanding that this is not simply an individual issue, that this is a community issue, and that we will stop focusing on ourselves and on individual rights and start thinking more about our community and the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of country we want to have. Because that's been our legacy as Canadians. We've really cared about each other. And not to just dismiss everything as religious dogma. Oh, well, you're religious, you believe something, therefore everything you're saying is hogwash. You know, that, I've had that happen to me, but let's not do that today. Okay, so two important themes in the civic arena are public safety and preserving our social heritage of caring. Sadly, talking about palliative care is not something that actually works in the public arena, because what people who support this say, oh yeah, we think palliative care is great, we just want this additional thing on top of it. And also people think when they hear about palliative care, they start thinking about, oh well, that's end of life, that's suffering, you know, I don't want to think about that. So the two places that I think more people are able to hear what we have to say come from public safety and preserving our heritage. If you want more information about palliative care, you can email me and I will send you that. I haven't put a lot in this presentation about palliative care because I think most people know something about it. So public safety. What are the public safety issues? Vulnerable people are more at risk, and we are actually protected by being risk averse. And there are problems and expansion where it's already legal, and then there's a bit of hubris, you know, that Greek idea of having such arrogance that you know it all, simplistic thinking of thinking that we can actually know the prognosis of someone, for example, or understand all the factors that might play into it. So looking at what the societal ethos is, Dr. Tom Koch is a gerontologist and an ethicist, and I've got his website down as in the slides at the end, which gives some resources. He is not a Christian. He will tell you he calls himself a humanitarian, and he is a person with a visual disability, and he is very concerned about these issues. He's a former journalist and also is able to really articulate these positions well. And I sent him a little email, and he sent me back the things that are on these next few slides. And I think it's very insightful and a really good foundation for our discussion this morning. He said, we really need to reclaim the language because it's been hijacked. Supporters of euthanasia, I'm just going to use the word euthanasia to mean everything. Say they talk about end-of-life decision-making, when it's really deciding to end life. It's not making decisions around the end of your life, it's deciding to end your life. And it's not about aid in dying, but it's about termination, which is the term the Dutch use. The Dutch talk about medical termination or termination. They don't kind of make these euphemisms about medical aid in dying. Dr. Balfour Mount, who is the founder of Palliative Care in Canada, I just was at a big Palliative Care International meeting, and he was in Montreal, and he was there, and he said, what is this called, medical aid in dying? That's what I've been doing for the last 30 years or 40 years. So he says, I thought that's what I was doing. And palliative care people feel the same way. That's what we are doing. We're helping people at the end of life. But the reason it was called that in Quebec is because if you can redefine killing as a medical procedure, then you don't have to go through the federal criminal court. You can stay in the healthcare jurisdiction of the province. So they never used the word suicide, they never used the word killing, they never used anything that had to do with death except for the word dying. So they have redefined the practice of medicine to include killing. And I'm just going to read this, what Tom wrote, because it's so good. He said, this is not about autonomy or independence in a battle against medical paternalism. People are free to autonomously refuse care. People are free to commit suicide, a choice we may lament but cannot prevent. Sorry. Rather, it is about the desire of some for us to accept their judgment that life is not worth living, embrace and facilitate their deaths through medical interventions approved by the state and supported by it. So I think that's really important for us to see, that we're not talking about someone just committing suicide on their own. We're talking about some folks asking us to say, yes, your life isn't worth living, and we will support that decision, and we will support it through our programs and our tax dollars. It's not just about acceptance, it's about affirmation of the choice, okay? And here's another thing he said: it's not about dignity, but rather hubris. Disability lawyer activists like Harriet McBride Johnson and Diane Coleman repeatedly point this out. Equating the need for help with indignity assumes only the purely independent are worthy of continuance. Now, is that the kind of society that we want to have? And he says, so it is not whose life is this, but what life will we support as a people, and what deaths will we encourage through our programs? So think about that as the issues. Okay, now I know there's a lot of text on this one. Bill Peace is a really interesting fellow from the United States he writes a blog called The Bad Cripple. So you can tell he's got a little attitude. He's got a lovely black lab, like I have a black lab. But he was involved in the state of Massachusetts. There was the House Initiative 998, and he was just kind of appalled at what was going on. And basically he said, at no point are the larger cultural implications of assisted suicide legalization considered. And he said, the proponents, later it says, the proponents wore blue stickers that read, "My life, my choice, my death," and this slogan is wrong. Simply put, no human being dies in a social vacuum. If you've ever been around a family or had someone that you care about commit suicide, you know that that's the truth. That is something that no family ever gets over, a suicide. And how people die, I can tell you from my years of experience that how people die makes a huge difference to their family members and to the people who were involved in that death for the rest of the lives of those people, and sometimes even for generations. And I think some of the push for what is happening now is that people had a bad experience with a grandparent or a parent years ago before we had good end-of-life care, and they're very worried that that's going to happen to them, and they want a way out. So he had a really good post. The whole post was from a year ago at Christmas, and I've got the reference on my slide, so you could go and look at it if you wanted to. So what kind of a world do we want to leave for our grandchildren? Are we being good stewards of our cultural heritage of respect for life? And this idea that somehow autonomy is unlimited and nothing should limit our autonomy, we don't have any trouble saying you can't smoke in places. In Vancouver, we're very green. You can't even smoke outdoors in a public park in Vancouver, okay? So because of the harm that it might do to others. And the impact of that secondhand smoke is so much less on the culture at large than the impact of legalizing assisted suicide or legalizing euthanasia. But somehow, we can't have any problem, we can't put any limitations on personal autonomy, but we do it all the time. We say that you have to drive a certain speed, even though some here may be able to drive faster than that and be quite safe. Well, because for the good of us all, we choose a speed limit. Some people may be able to drive with the blood alcohol above what the legal limit is and be perfectly safe, maybe even safer than some people who are below the legal limit. But we say no. And my friend Will Johnston, he's a physician and the head of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in BC, says that if we live on an island that has no snakes at all, and somebody decides they want to import some poisonous snakes to be pets, And they say, oh, well, we'll take care of them. We'll make sure that they never get out. We'll, you know, it'll just be only our snakes, and it's only in our house, and it won't bother you. Well, we all know that that is not actually what usually happens, that they can't guarantee that the snakes are not going to get out. And we were hearing from Larry from New Brunswick, and we know what happened in New Brunswick, where the snakes got out and killed the children upstairs from the pet store. But as Will says, the way that the question is framed isn't, should people be allowed to keep poisonous or deadly snakes? What they say is, should people be allowed to keep pets? And everybody says, oh, sure, we should keep pets. Well, what about exotic pets? Well, I guess that's okay. What about reptiles? Well, that would probably be okay too. Well, how about these beautiful, exotic, deadly snakes? Well, I guess if you're allowed to do these other things, you might as well be allowed to do that. So it's not this thing where somebody asks you right out, you know, should you keep these snakes? So we need to be thinking about what the implications are downstream when we say yes to things. Margaret Somerville, if you haven't read her things, I highly recommend the things that she writes. She is the Gale Professor of Law and Medicine at McGill, and she has a great body of work trying to help us in a secular society see if we can come to some consensus about the things that are important to us. And she says, why are we debating euthanasia now? And one of the things that's really interesting is she says not one of the bottom line conditions usually linked with calls for legalizing euthanasia, that a person is terminally ill, wants to die, and we can kill them, is new. So this has been we've always been able, everybody's been dying for a long time, we've always been able to kill them. Why are we calling for it now? And so she says that she thinks it's profound changes in our postmodern secular Western democratic societies and how these things happen, how these are interrelated. And making wise decisions about whether or not to legalize these things, we need to think very carefully about this. So it's actually prudent to be risk averse. Doctors are conservative for a reason. And I'm just going to go on through this here. Because 10 to 20 years over a 2,400-year history of Hippocratic medicine, that doesn't really give you very much time for any negative effects to take place. We can't know all the outcomes or ramifications of decisions that are made. Some bright light decided that Central Park in New York City needed to have all the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare living in the park. So that was how the starling got introduced to North America, was from that. Now, 10 or 20 years after the starling was introduced, it probably wasn't such a bad idea, but now the starlings cause a huge amount of damage. They're a major